All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Brianna Coma, and I am with Conservation Nebraska. We'll give it a couple minutes to let a few people trickle in, but thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to learn about bats. And just a couple reminders before we get started. Everybody is muted, and your cameras are off, so you cannot be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please just type them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, so if you missed anything or you want to share this at any point, it will be posted in Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And then lastly, at the end of the webinar, there will be a short poll that pops up. And we would really appreciate you all filling it out. It's super short and quick. It just helps Conservation Nebraska to improve on future webinars and see what you guys like to listen to and see and fun stuff like that. So with that being said, I am going to, there we go. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So now with that being said, let's fly into the world of bats with Chris Phil. He is the coordinator of bat monitoring with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Nebraska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research. His research involves looking at spatial patterns of bat foraging activity throughout Nebraska. And now I will hand it over to Chris to present about Nebraska's bats.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for streaming into this presentation. If you're here to learn about bats, you've come to the right place. So I thought I'd start off with some myths and common misconceptions that a lot of people have when they think about bats. This here actually is a young female northern long-eared bat that I caught as part of my master's thesis here at the university. And we caught her in a project down at the Homestead National Monument of America, which is about an hour south of Lincoln in Nebraska. So if you didn't think or had doubts about there actually being bats in Nebraska, here's some photographic evidence to suggest the opposite, that bats are actually here in Nebraska. So a lot of people, when they hear bats, because a lot of bats sort of look like mice, people think that bats are just mice with wings, they're flying rodents. And bats actually aren't related to mice at all. They're their own group of mammals called Chiroptera, which means hand wing, because that's all essentially a bat's wing is. It's just a modified hand. Bats actually, I'm not really sure how the phrase blind as a bat came about, because bats can actually see quite well. If you think about it, these bats, they're flying, most of them are nocturnal. So they're doing everything at night. So you have to be able to see. So many of them, their eyesight is about as good as ours, if not better. But many bats also supplement that with really high frequency sounds called echolocation. And it basically functions as sonar. So bats are, I'll talk about that later, but bats are able to see very well as they fly around at night. Also, bats are not really interested. They will not fly in your hair. They will not make nests in your hair. They're not really interested in your hair at all. Some bats have some wild hair of their own. So on the left is a crested bat. This bat lives in Asia, Southeast Asia, and this is actually a male. They'll use these crests for trying to attract females and things like that. But bats are not interested in your hair. A lot of people think bats are spooky and they think Halloween. So hopefully I'll be able to convince you otherwise. Also, a lot of people, they think that all bats carry rabies, and that's not true. Actually, less than 1% of wild bats actually carry rabies. Researchers such as myself, since we handle bats, we do have rabies pre-exposure vaccinations just in case. So if you do encounter a wild bat, still not wise, leave it alone, don't pick it up or anything, but you're more likely to get rabies from a dog or another animal. And of course, we've all heard about COVID-19. So a lot of people were quick to pin the culprit on bats being at fault. So there are bats in Eastern Asia that have been found to carry various coronaviruses, but none have been found to carry COVID-19. So you don't have to worry about bats in the United States, which do not carry these diseases. You do not have to worry about getting COVID from a bat here. Vampires are another thing that comes to mind for a lot of people when they hear about bats. So there are actually 3 species of bat, vampire bat. None of them live in the United States. You actually find these throughout Central and South America. So from left to right, we have the common vampire bat, the white-winged vampire bat, and the hairy-legged vampire bat. So all these species, you won't encounter them here in the United States, but even if you did, they don't really drink human blood. They actually prefer like chicken blood and bird blood and other wild animals. So you should still be okay. Some we do have on our side that a lot of people think is cool is Batman. So that is one upside, one thing that we do have going for us. So all that aside, what is a bat? So I touched on the fact that bats aren't rodents. They are mammals, and they're their own group of mammals called Chiroptera, so handwing. And that's all a bat's wing is. They have a structure, a bone structure very similar to ours. So their wing is just, they have a shoulder, an elbow, and a wrist, and then they have 5 fingers. And their wing is just skin webbing strung between all their fingers. And so that's how they're able to fly. Bats are mammals, so they have hair. They give birth to live young. A lot of bats, some bats are actually pretty long-lived. Some bats have been found to live 30 years or more, which is pretty long for such a small mammal. But you can find bats on every continent except Antarctica. So there's a lot of bats out there across the world. So I don't know if the chat works, but I thought I'd ask how many bat species there are. You can come up with a number in your head. I'll give you some time to think about how many bat species there might be out there. I can talk about this bat in the meantime, which is one of my favorites. It's called the spotted bat. You can find this bat in the deserts in Western North America, but they hunt insects. They're able to fly around and actually crawl around on the ground, and they have these really big ears, which they use that echolocation, so they're very sensitive to sound, and they also have big ears because they're living in the desert, so it helps them dissipate heat and cool off. So there's actually over 1,200 species of bats, and so that's 20% of all mammals in the world. This is a very small subset of that, and even just from the small subset that I have here, you can see that there's a variety of different colors, sizes, morphologies. Different bats have different weird looking faces or big ears, small ears. And so all that allows different bats to thrive in different kinds of environments. And that's allows bats to hunt and live where we find them. So each is uniquely adapted for certain kinds of environments. So these are some more bats. Most of your bats actually you find in tropical areas. So many of these bats here you find in Central and South America. On either, we have white Honduran white bats on the upper left. And so these and the bats on the upper right are both kinds of tent making bats. So they'll sort of manipulate the trees, they'll nibble it such that the leaves sort of collapse on themselves and they form sort of like a tent. And so that's how they get their namesakes. The round-eared bats in the middle, these also live in Central America and South America, and they eat termites. So they burrow into termite mounds, and that's where they live, and they eat the termites there. On the bottom left, we have Spix's disc-winged bats, and so these have suckers on their hands, which allows them to better grab onto slippery surfaces. These bats live actually in Asia, parts of Asia. We've got wrinkled-faced bats, which are kind of weird looking, but these bats are also in Central America. Actually, the males, you'll notice there's kind of this flap of skin under the face. And so what the males do is they'll sing to attract females, and they'll actually move that mask and cover their face. They'll move it up and down as they sing. And that's one way that they attract females. And then on the right, we have a woolly bat. So this bat lives in Asia, and it actually lives in, it targets these pitcher plants, which are filled with these digestive juices that the plant produces to attract insects to it. And so the bat actually hangs out in these pitcher plants and it eats the insects that the plant attracts. And in turn, it'll defecate in the plant, and that's how the plant sort of makes up for the insects that the bat ate. And that's how it gets its nutrients. On the left, we have a yellow-winged bat, which you would find in Africa. And these are parts of, they belong to a group of bats called false vampire bats. And they have these really long noses. And that's actually what they use to make their echolocation sounds. So you find these bats through Africa, and to the right of that, we have all the bats up to this point that I've shown are microbats. So that's your smaller bats. And then you also have your mega bats, which are your larger bats. And so that's what these are on the right. They're called flying foxes because their face looks like a fox and they fly. So very, very creative naming system, but some bats, they form these huge swarms and colonies that they form. And so that's what these bats are doing. You can find these bats throughout Asia and Australia, but you don't actually have to travel to those places to see huge swarms of bats. We actually have them right here in North America, actually fairly close to Nebraska, just south of Nebraska and Texas. And so these are called Brazilian or Mexican free-tailed bats. They migrate up from Central and South America to these caves and various structures around Austin, Texas and San Antonio. And so they'll migrate during the summer and have their pups. So there's about 20 million bats in these caves. And so if each of them's having a baby, that population is going to double. They actually form the largest aggregations of mammals found anywhere in the world, right there. And they, every night they're flying out, eating insects, and they're actually so dense that they show up on Doppler radar. So people scanning, using radar to scan for weather patterns, these bats actually show up. So there's a lot of different bats of mega bats, your big bats, your small bats, but these are the biggest bat on the left in the world you find in the Philippines, which is in Asia, and it's called the golden crowned flying fox. So this bat has a wingspan of about 5.5 feet. So I'm like 5'8", so that's almost as tall as I am, which is pretty big. But then you also have your smallest micro bat, which is nicknamed the bumblebee bat. And it's only about the size of your pointer finger, and it only weighs 2 grams. So very, very light. So a lot of different bats all over the world, all sorts of sizes. All of them are adapted to eat different things. So this here is one of our flying foxes, and he's eating a banana. So that's one thing that bats eat. I might have mentioned a few others, but yeah, if you can think of other things you might think of what bats eat while you watch this video. So bats eat a lot of different things. So the bat on the upper left is also a fruit-eating bat. We have our common vampire bat again. So a lot of people actually think that vampire bats drink blood. They don't actually. They make, when they find a host, they'll make a cut and they'll just lap up the blood. They'll lick it up with their tongue. So they're not actually drinking, as they are like just licking it up. But you also have most of the bats in the world actually eat insects, which is good for people who don't like insect crop pests and things like that, or mosquitoes. So bats will eat all those things. On the bottom right, we have the lesser long-nosed bat. So there's also a lot of bats that aren't after fruit, but they pollinate flowers because they're after the nectar, and they get the powder all over their face. That's how some plants are pollinated. And then there's other bats that eat a variety of small animals. So we have a bat eating a fish. There are bats that eat lizards, other bats, other various small vertebrates and invertebrates. So a little more about our fishing bats. There's a collection of fishing bats. These are called bulldog bats, and they get that name because they're from the bottom right, their face sort of looks like a bulldog. So what these bats do, you'll find these bats living in Central and South America and the Caribbean. So these bats, they'll fly around and they'll be scanning the surface of the water to see if they can see any ripples, any fish close to the surface. And then all they do is they rake their claws over and they just pluck it out of the water. And so these bats are also using echolocation to sense all of their prey and their surroundings. I'll touch on that. I'll elaborate on that later, but that's how these bats are catching their prey. And then these are our pollinating bats. So this bat's after the nectar. On the right, this is a saguaro cactus, and it only blooms at night. And so this bat is really the only thing that pollinates these plants. And once again, it's after the nectar, so it gets the pollen all over its face and it transfers that from flower to flower. So they operate very much like insects do up here. Then I had to bring up our vampire bats again because these bats are cool in that they're able to walk, hop, and they have sort of a gallop. So not many bats are able to sort of walk on the ground like this. And that's how these bats are able to sort of sneak up on their prey, even though they are also able to fly. And in addition to echolocation, they actually have these heat sensing organs on their faces. And so that operates as a sort of thermal imaging, and that they're able to see the heat that living creatures are giving off. And so that's the other way in which they're able to see the prey that they're going to sneak up on. And then this is another bat. This bat actually lives in the western United States. It's called the Pallid bat. And so it is also able to hop around on the ground like the vampire bats do, but it doesn't have those heat-seeking organs in its face. It's using that echolocation sound. So that's why it has very big ears. Also, it's living in the desert, like the spotted bat. It's able to dissipate heat through those ears. So these guys, they'll mostly eat insects, small invertebrates. So this one has actually cornered a scorpion that's not too happy it's been found. And yeah, these bats eat scorpions, which is pretty cool. Also have other bats. On the left, we have a fringe-lipped bat. So this bat you will find in Central and South America, which actually eats frogs. So you have frogs at night, they're making these croaking sounds, and the males are trying to compete with each other, let the females know where they are. And so they want to be loud enough to communicate with the other frogs, but they don't want to be so loud that they give themselves away, because these bats are listening to them. And if they give themselves away, they're going to be eaten. And there are, so there's also spectral bats. These bats are a bit bigger, which are also in Central and South America. And since they're bigger, they'll actually eat larger things like other bats. This one has a bird. They'll eat lizards and insects. So a lot of bats that eat a lot of different things. All the bats in North America primarily eat insects. So the bats we find here are all eating insects. So this here is a little brown bat, and he's using that echolocation calls to pinpoint where this flying moth is, and he's going to swoop it up with his tail. And that flap of skin between his tail and his feet is called the uropatagium, which is a very weird word. But he basically scoops up that moth, he transfers it to his mouth, and then he can eat it while he's still flying, or he can land on a tree and eat it there, and then go after more insects. So a lot of bats eat a lot of different things, but a lot of different things also eat bats. So on the upper left, there are snakes that live in Central and South America that will opportunistically feed on bats. So you have bats that are flying out of these caves. And so what these snakes do is they'll stretch out their head and their neck over the entrance of caves. And as these bats are billowing out, if one hits the snake, it'll immediately try to recoil and constrict that bat and suffocate it, and then it's able to eat it. So that's how those snakes are able to get and feed on bats. To the right of that, we have a bat hawk, which lives in Asia and Australia and feeds almost exclusively on bats. But we also have hawks and owls here in the United States that will opportunistically, bats don't make a huge part of their diet, but if they're given the chance and they're hungry enough, they will try to eat bats. Pretty much anything else, like raccoons, even feral cats, if they're able to go, a lot of bats will roost in trees. So if they're able to get within reach of a bat, anything pretty much that can do that will eat them. So there have been researchers that have seen hibernating bats in caves that hibernate lower to the ground, and this raccoon basically comes along and just plucks them off. But there are other birds like blue jays will eat bats. I saw a posting today of a bullfrog that was eating a bat. So the bat probably fell in the water. It's pretty much anything that can get their mouth on a bat will eat them. But the video in the middle is actually our flying foxes in Australia, what happens is during the summertime, it gets too hot. And so they need to cool themselves off and get a drink. And so there's these crocodiles that are flying really still in the water. And if the bats fly close enough to them, they'll try to knock them out of the air. So a lot of things in other countries, people will eat bats if they need to, or if they want to. Hopefully not so much here. So I touched on echolocation a few times. And so this is basically, it's really dark for bats to see. And so a lot of them, in order to get detailed information about their environment, will make these really high frequency calls that are out of the range of human hearing. And it basically operates as sonar. And so every pulse, every sound that the bats make will go out and it'll bounce off everything. And that comes back to the bat as the mental image. And so that's how it's able to map its surroundings. And so different bats will echolocate differently depending on their environment and what they're trying to do. So if you're a bat flying through the woods trying to catch a moth, for instance, you're going to echolocate a lot because you want a lot of detailed information very fast so the moth doesn't get away and you don't go crashing into a tree or something. Versus if you're another bat that's out in an open field, you're probably going to echolocate less just because you're just trying to get some basic information. There's not a lot going on. But bats will also talk to each other through echolocation. They have social calls that they use. So echolocation assists a lot of bats for hunting and doing anything really at night. And so the bat on the left, we have the big brown bat, which is a common species that you'll find throughout much of North America. You can find them here in Nebraska. And so these bats would be a species that are catching insects, flying through woods. So it makes echolocation calls with its tongue and its throat. And it has a very highly developed means of echolocating. So it's able to pinpoint prey, avoid obstacles and things like that. But you have other bats, like the one on the right, which is an Egyptian fruit bat, which actually you can see at the Omaha Zoo. They have them there, but they eat fruit, and fruit doesn't really run around, so you don't have to chase it. So they don't use echolocation so much, and they actually use it with their wings. So when they flap with their wings, they'll make clicking sounds they're able to see their environment, not as detailed as a big brown bat, but they also have larger eyes, which enables them to see better as well. This here is a bat that is using echolocation to hone in on that flying moth. And once he gets close enough, he's gonna swat it out of the air with its wing and scoop it up with his tail. So different bats are able to forage in different areas and hunt different things based on their morphology. So this is a very agile bat. Other larger bats might not be able to do something like this. Some interesting, there's a species of bat called the eastern red bat, which lives in Nebraska and much of eastern United States. And when they catch an insect, they sort of do a little barrel roll as they catch it. So they're a very agile species. So bringing it into here in Nebraska, these are all the different species that you could encounter based on where you are in the state. So Nebraska is interesting based on where it is geographically in that it lies at the edge of several bat species, its ranges. So in the eastern half of the state, you'll get your eastern US bats, and then some of those sort of peter out, and then you get your western US bats. And so I did include the Brazilian free-tailed on here, just even though it's very rare that they come up this far north, but there have been instances where researchers have caught them. So you're more likely to see them though in like Texas and places like that. So I thought I'd go through each one. And so this is an evening bat, which you find in eastern Nebraska and much of eastern North America. So this is a pretty small bat. It's only 7 to 14 grams. And this bat, during the summer, it will roost in trees and buildings. And like most of the bats here, it likes to eat small insects. And every year, females usually have 2 pups. Pups is what we call baby bats. And they live 5 years, which is, a fairly decent age for a bat. But they sort of look like little big brown bats, which I'll touch on later. We have our tricolor bats, which are a little smaller, but you can find them throughout much more of eastern North America. These bats really like to roost in caves and mines and cracks in the rock, more so than most other bat species here. They'll eat pretty much any small insect, but they do like their moths and beetles and mosquitoes. And females usually have two pups every year. But this bat and the northern long-eared bat and the little brown bat, which I'll touch on next, aren't as common throughout much of their range due to a variety of factors. The main culprit would be white nose syndrome, which I'll touch on, which is a fungal disease. But these bats, northern long-eared bats, you can find up into most of Canada. And it's also a fairly small bat, 6 to 9 grams. During the winter, these bats will roost in caves and mines. But during the summertime, they mostly roost in trees. And so with these bats, every spring, females will usually, for this species and some other species, they'll sort of have their pups together. And a few trees, they'll form these maternity colonies and have their babies together. The males sort of run off and do their own thing. But these bats will eat a variety of small insects, and they live a bit longer, about 18 years, but they only have 1 pup every year. So that's a problem with a lot of bats that are suffering from, or that are in decline, is that while they're long-lived, they don't reproduce a lot. They only have like 1 or 2 pups every year. This is our little brown bat, which also isn't doing so well from white nose syndrome, but you can find this throughout much of North America, all the way up to Alaska even. So Nebraska's sort of right at the edge of that zone. You find it throughout the outskirts of Nebraska. So this is also a fairly small bat, 7 to 14 grams. This bat also roosts in caves, mines, and buildings and trees. This bat seems to have a preference for foraging over ponds and streams. They really like those bugs that are flying over water. And these bats have been found, I think there was one of these bats was found to be over 30 years. So they're even longer lived, but they only have 1 pup every year. And then as we go to the western half of the state, we have our western species. So these are long-legged bats, which you can find from southern Alaska all the way down into Mexico. And so this is also a pretty small bat. All these bats are pretty small. You can fit most of them in the palm of your hand. They're that small. But these bats like to roost in trees and rocks and eat small insects as well. And they're, 21 years is pretty long for a bat. We have our fringe bats, which extend all the way down even further than Mexico. And these bats are even smaller, 5 to 7 grams. They roost in caves and mines as well. And these guys are usually target like beetles and moths. That's what they like to eat. And I put separate by their litter size because something interesting I found is that these maternity colonies for this bat, they'll actually sort of have a separate roosting site for their pups, and they'll fly over there and they'll feed them, but then the adults have their own place that they roost, which I thought was kind of interesting. We have our Western small-footed bat as opposed to our Eastern small-footed bat. These bats have a much smaller range where you can find them. They're also only 4 to 6 grams, roosting in the same sorts of structures, and they're after moths and flies and beetles. So, Wisconsin big-eared bats are a bit different because their ears are just so big, but these bats are a bit larger. They really only roost in caves and mines. So you can see you'll find them in Western North America, but there's 2 other sort of isolated populations where there's more extensive cave systems where you could also find these sorts of bats. But they eat almost exclusively moths and live about 16 years. So they're right at the edge of Nebraska. And then these are the species that you could find throughout the state, throughout much of North America, except the eastern red bat is confined pretty much to the eastern United States. So all these bats, we have our silver-haired bats, which are 8 to 11 grams. So all these bats are slightly bigger. You can find these bats roosting in trees, but also like barnyards, piles of woods. Our big brown bats are probably the most common bat that people see. They're the ones that are usually find inside your house, in your attics, things like that. These bats really like those kinds of structures, and they actually have a stronger jaw, so they like to eat beetles and things like that. So they're a pretty common species. But the hoary bat on the lower left is actually the largest bat in North America, 25 to 30 grams. So it's substantially bigger than our other bats. They roost in pretty much just trees, and they'll eat larger prey too, like moths. And they'll actually, since they're so big, they sort of bully other bats, and they'll occasionally eat small bats. They're also the only mammal. There's a Hawaiian subspecies, and they're the only native mammal to Hawaii. So I'm not really sure how they got out there, but they did somehow. And eastern red bats are sort of unique in that, like during the summer they'll roost in trees, but for winter they don't really hibernate in trees or caves or things like that. They sort of just curl up in a ball and hide under leaf litter, which I don't know how they do it, but they're able to survive winters by doing that. But they'll actually have litter sizes of up to 4 bats. So that's, larger than, or more, they reproduce more than the other bats here. So there are a lot of benefits that bats have for the environment and for people. So most of the bat species worldwide eat insects, and some can eat their own weight or more every night in insects. So if you think about like those Brazilian free-tailed bats that form these huge swarms and are flying out every night, like if each of them is eating their weight or even less, like that's still a lot of insects that they're eating every night. And so there have been some studies that have suggested that these bats can save billions of dollars in terms of eating insect crop pests, which is good news for us. But there are also other bats that pollinate flowers. There are over 300 species of a fruiting plant that are pollinated almost exclusively by these bats, including your bananas. So we have our cave nectar bats, which you can find through Asia, but there are other bats that live in Central and South America that will also pollinate bananas and mangoes and guavas. So our bat on the upper right is the Mexican long-nosed bat. There are a handful of these long-nosed, long-tongued bats that live in Central and South America. These bats will pollinate, in addition to other plants, the agave plant from which tequila is made. And so there are various kinds, that's just, those of you that are of age to drink and like your tequila, that's just another reason to like bats. But there are actually bat-friendly tequila brands out there, because when farmers harvest the agave plants to make tequila, they get it right as it has its most sugar, which is right before it shoots up its stalk and flowers. So some farmers will let some of their plants actually flower, otherwise there would be no plants for these bats to pollinate. So researchers like myself who are interested in studying bats, you might think, how would you go about catching a bat? And so there are a couple of tools that we use. One of the most common ones is called a mist net, and it looks like a big volleyball net, but it has a very fine mesh netting. And so we put these nets up along trails and woods where there's trees all around, or over streams, sort of these flyways that bats are able to fly through. And if they see the net at the last second, there's really no way around it. So they end up getting tangled up. And so we're able to go in there and extract them. There are nets that are designed to catch birds, but bat nets will also catch birds. So we don't really open our nets until after sunset, because we want to minimize our catching birds. But I have been on a few crews where we've caught owls, even flying squirrels, which any researcher will tell you is a real hassle to try to get out of a net. You sort of let them get out on their own, sort of help them as you can, but you don't want to get bit or anything. So we try to minimize that. But in the bottom center image is a trap called a harp trap. So this is sort of it's got a metal frame, and there's fishing wire or some other wire that's strung up and down. And so we can put these at the entrances of caves, for instance, and the bats, when they fly out, they'll hit the wire or the string, and they'll fall into the bag. And so a lot of bats aren't able to take off from the ground, and these bats aren't able to climb out. Some are, but we're watching the bag pretty closely. And so they're much easier to extract, from a harp trap than, say, versus a mist net. But the mist nets cover more areas. So there are pros and cons to each, but these are two of the common tools that we use to catch bats. So once we are able to extract the bat from the net, we're able to weigh these bats, take various measurements. We can see the health of these bats. If they're adults, for instance, females, we can tell if they're pregnant or if they've had pups already. We can tell if they're old or young bats. And if there are bats of certain interests, we're interested in seeing how far they fly, or what structures they're using to spend their daytime hours. We'll actually attach a little radio transmitter to their backs, and that they usually fall off after 2 weeks if the bats haven't gotten rid of them sooner, but it lets out a certain beeping noise at a certain frequency. And so we are able to use telemetry equipment to listen to this beep and track these bats and see how they're behaving. So I included a couple of release videos from projects I've been on where we're catching bats and releasing them. So these are both on a project at the Homestead National Monument as part of my master's research. But on the left, we're releasing a evening bat. And so you can see how they're able to sort of throw themselves in the air, and then they sort of drop. So a lot of bats have to take off from a height to allow them to drop, so they can't really take off from the ground. I can replay that just for kicks, but the bat on the right is an eastern red bat, and they're actually able to take off from the ground. So they have enough energy to throw themselves up in the air. So I can that. And you can see how agile these bats are. You know, I don't really know how people thought bats were blind, because they really can't afford to be. This is a Ozark Bigeared Bat on a project I was on in eastern Oklahoma. So these are they live in caves. They're much like the Townsend Bigeared Bats that I talked about. But yeah, it's cool when you actually get to see bats up close and personal. And so these are some places on projects I've been to where we've tracked bats that we tagged. On the left, we tracked, this is a eastern small-footed bat in Tennessee, so one of the smallest species of bat in North America. And this bat, well, we found him in a rock crevice over an overhang. And so he had just wriggled his way back there. To the right of that, we have another bat of the same species, and we track this one to a wood pile in an old barn. So they're not too picky about where they roost. To the right of that is a northern long-eared bat in eastern Nebraska, and we track this young male underneath a raised slab of bark. You can see his antenna sticking out, but I overlaid that with a thermal imaging, so you can see the bat actually underneath the bark. He's the red blob in the middle, but you can see the two little heat spots on either side. That's the base of his ears, so he's actually looking right at us. We tracked another one of these bats to a fence. That's what this female decided to use, but they also used a variety of different cavities and trees. The bat on the lower right is actually a northern yellow bat, which you can find. One of my colleagues was tracking this bat in coastal South Carolina, and this bat was just content enough to roost on a branch, which is what several bats do. You might notice some of these bats have these armbands on their wrists, and so each of those has a unique number, sort of like a band that people use for birds. And so if someone caught this bat down the road, they would be able to look back and see where this bat had been caught previously. That's one way that researchers actually study bats, is to catch them. Another is to tap into the echolocation calls that a lot of bats make. So different bats have different structures to their calls, and we can actually match calls to species if we get quality calls. So the upper sequence is from a big brown bat. It's fairly uniform, and as opposed to the hoary bat, which is our largest species of bat, these bats tend to make sounds that are lower in frequency, and they're sort of more, they're more raggedy looking. So those are different ways that we're able to tell what bats came from, or what sounds came from which bats. But it's also tricky because a lot of bats make a lot of similar sounds, so it takes some learning to master that skill. These are more echolocation sounds from bats in a different software program. So we have on the upper left our big brown bat again, and then to the right of that our eastern red bat. So eastern red bats tend to have more of a hook at the end of their calls. That's one thing that we look for. Bottom left, we have our hoary bat again, so much more raggedy in their calls. And then to the right of that, we have our silver-haired bat, one of their calls. And when you look at it, you can sort of see the different kinds of calls that it makes. And that's based on the different sorts of environment that it's in when it's making that sound and what it's trying to do. And so right now I'm on a project and we're using these acoustic detectors, like the one in the upper left, to tap into those acoustic calls that bats make. And we're able to monitor bat activity and the distributions of different bats across the state. And so we're implementing this method here in Nebraska, but it's part of a larger program that's across the country. And just one program to survey for bats. So each box in the state is a site that we sample. And so part of this program, we're trying to get more volunteers involved. So I have included my email at the end. So if you are interested in maybe helping out or learning more, don't hesitate to contact me. So we monitor bats because nowadays there's a lot of threats that bats are facing. So I brought up white nose syndrome a couple of times. This is a disease that was in the United States first found in New York back in around 2006. And researchers think that this fungus was brought over from Europe by a caver. And this fungus, it likes the cool, moist climate that caves provide. So it affects cave hibernating bats the most. And so it's most prominent on the faces, on the snouts of these bats. It sort of forms this white fluff. And so that's how it got called white nose syndrome. But this fungus, it grows on hibernating bats. And bats like to keep themselves very clean. They like to groom themselves. And so what this fungus does is the bats wake up and they use more water and all that the fat reserves that they stored up for the winter. They go through that a lot faster. And it also dissolves the bat's wing tissue. So if it's severely scarred enough, they won't be able to fly. So a lot of these bats don't make it through the winter. In some caves, almost 99% of these bats die. And this disease has been spreading from New York to across Eastern North America and up into Canada. It's made the jump to Washington and California. So we think it's only a matter of time before it spreads to other areas, but we try to minimize our caving. Wind farms are another threat to bats. So wind farms do kill a lot of birds, but they also kill a lot of bats. Researchers don't really know why bats are attracted to wind turbines. It could be that they're if we look at that image of this particular wind farm, it could be like the only roost available for these bats. They think it's a good roost, but wind farms like this tend to affect bats that migrate and fly at higher altitudes than others. So our hoary bats are one bats that are highly affected by this. And then also habitat loss. So we've seen a lot of bats, they roost in trees during the summer, and as more trees are cut down, that's just less places for bats to roost in. So that's one reason why you might find more bats in your home. But there are ways to help. So one way would be to provide a place for bats to roost in, a bat house. And so I pulled some of this information from Bat Conservation. They do a lot of bat house research, and they also make a lot of bat houses that you can buy or you can make your own. But they would recommend at least 24 inches by 16 inches. And since these bats are usually roost in trees anyway, it's good to make this out of wood. And bats like to stay really warm. So putting the bat box in a sunny area, place that gets a lot of sun or on the side of your house, which would help to insulate the bat box or just painting the bat box a dark color are all ways to accomplish that. And then making it high off the ground, for instance, on a pole where it's harder for predators to climb, or on the side of your house where it's more open, because a lot of bats need that to drop when they exit. And then since a lot of bats roost in debris and dying trees, as trees die and they fall over, they get more cracks and things like that, more cavities that bats like to roost in. So not removing dead vegetation and not entering caves to disturb bats are two ways to help in that regard. And then also just educating. A lot of people just don't know anything about bats, or they have these preconceived notions, or they believe these myths that bats are out to get them, or they're carrying rabies or things like that. So education is always a powerful tool. And yeah, with that, I can take questions. This is another northern long-eared bat as part of my master's research that we caught near Beatrice, just south of Lincoln. And so this young female, you can see the transmitter on her back and the band on her arm, but we were tracking this individual, and on this particular day, she was roosting with another young bat. So that was a good day for us. It was exciting to see. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Chris. That was incredible. We are going to move into questions. I see Guinea, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question? Oh, your hand went down. Okay, no worries. So we have a few more questions in the chat box. The first question is, they're concerned that native bat populations could become a COVID reservoir.
Yes, that's something that a lot of bat researchers were afraid of early on. So a lot of research that people were doing and projects that entailed people catching bats were put on hold because they were afraid that if people had COVID, they would give that to the bats and then they'd become a reservoir for it and give it back to us later. But there have been a number of studies that have looked into that, the likelihood of humans giving COVID to bats, and they've found that likelihood to be very low. So I'm hopeful that actually is the case.
Awesome. And Dave, you have your hand raised. Do you want to ask your question really quick? Okay, well, wait a second, maybe he'll come in. There's a question. Can scorpions make a bat sick or ever poison them? If it doesn't, how do they digest the poison?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. It could be that the bat is immune to the scorpion sting to a degree. I mean, even if you were, you still wouldn't want to get stung. Regardless, that's probably a painful experience. But either they're immune to it, or maybe they don't eat the stinger part. I would actually have to do a little more research on that, but those are some hypotheses.
All right, and Dave, you still have your hand raised. Do you want to ask your question? Otherwise, you can put it in the chat box too. Otherwise, Marsh, you also have your hand raised. Oh, Dave, you're muted. Maybe that's why. Okay, Marsh, would you like to ask your question? Okay, maybe we'll come back to the hand raises last. I'm sorry. All right. So our next question is from Anne. She says,
can you hear me?
oh yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I somehow I was muted and I couldn't unmute. This is Dave. The question I wanted to put up several bat boxes around my farmyard, and in reading about it, they're saying put it in a warm spot. Well, should that be on the east side, west side, south side of a building? And is there anything a person can do to help attract bats to the bat box?
Yeah, so bats, like all animals, they need to drink and they like to roost in trees. So if you put the box, near or closer to things like that, that would help to encourage bats to move in. If you had them in your house, probably putting it near where they're able to get into your house, like sort of like putting it right there so they can see it and they're like, oh, maybe this is a better place to move into. I do know that, yeah, it can be tricky to sort of get bats to move into a bat house initially, but once they know it's there, they're likely to come back and keep using it. So yeah, I've never actually tried it. I know it can be tricky. I've heard it can be tricky. And then, yeah, I guess I'm not sure about in terms of exactly where on the house. Could, either east or west where the sun rises up or sets, because that's where the bat house would start warming up earlier or later. But even just painting the bat box a dark color, you don't want it based on where you live. Like if you were in the South, I know you probably wouldn't want to paint your bat box black. It might be too warm, but Nebraska's not really like that. So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out. Yeah, I'm here in Nebraska, and I've got a granary kind of in the middle of the yard. I don't have any bats in my house particularly, but I know I shouldn't put it on the north side. But I was just looking east side. I know it'll get warm in the morning, but cool down by evening. But on the west side, well, it's going to end up being hot at night than in the evening. But which is there a better habitat for them? From what I read, trees isn't necessarily the best place to put a bat house.
Well, you could put it. I would put it. In considering trees, like bats will roost in trees naturally, and they also tend to stick pretty close to trees when they're foraging and using the landscape. So that's sort of like a natural place that bats would be using already, and then they'd be more likely to see and use the bat house. But bats, all the bats here in North America are nocturnal. So even if the bat house got warm later, the bats would by then be active enough where they would be starting to fly around and wouldn't necessarily be in the bat house. Or in the morning when bats are just starting to come back after flying around all night. So
okay, one last question. Would it be better to put it on I've got a yard light. Would it be better to put it on the back side away from the yard light, or does it matter or the yard light sign to get rid of the mosquitoes in the area that I'm going to be occupying during the evening hours?
yeah, I don't know that the light would necessarily, that bats would be I don't think it would be like a make or break deal for the bats. I know some bats are attracted to light because it attracts the insects, other bats not so much. So yeah, I don't think that the light would necessarily factor in terms of putting out a house. It would probably factor more into where the bats would actually start hunting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was a great question. And then Marsh, you also have your hand raised. Did we
Yeah.
get you to? Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, yes. I've had some issues in the past with bats getting in the house, and I've had to remove them. I've had like a bug net around to be able to do that. Do you have any suggestions on a better device to catch bats in the house or anything like that?
Yeah, so I don't know that I've seen where you can, I mean, a net is probably harder because once like the bat can get tangled in the net and then it's going to be harder for it to get out. You might have to help it get out and then risk being bit. But just, you could like, if you let the bat sort of, if it's flying around, eventually it's going to settle down and it's going to land somewhere. And so you could put some sort of like a pot or a pan over it and sort of slide something underneath, in which case then you could carry it outside. Also, so a lot of bats, since they roost in caves, they're actually able to sense from the pressure and the air current from the mouth of the cave. So if actually you just sort of open up your windows and your doors, they'll eventually be able to find out which way is out, and they'll be able to, I mean, you could maybe sort of help them along, but eventually they'll be able to find their way out. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I've never had a bat in my house.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mish. That was a great question. All right. And Jennifer also has her hand raised.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, how are bats a danger to bees? Do they eat bees?
Bats eat a variety of, so most bats are nocturnal, so they're gonna eat whatever insects are flying around at night. So I don't know in my head if bees are out active at night, in which case if they're not, then they should be pretty safe.
Okay.
Good question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, hey, this is Kim in Sioux City, Iowa. Hey, I've built a couple bat houses. One of them's a 4-chamber that I've built, and it's more set up as a nursery. I just mounted it a couple of weeks ago. But for a couple of years, I've had a single chamber. And what's cool is I have cameras in the chambers and they go to a DVR. So I have a lot of footage of the bats coming and going out of the single chamber. I don't out of the 4-chamber yet, but the cameras are in, and all I have to do is hook them up. Would anyone be interested in seeing any of that footage?
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly send it to me.
Okay,
I'll
do that. It's pretty cool. It's
Do you have
I'm sorry,
bats,
what?
Do you have bats in the 4-chamber? Because I've heard, I mean, I'm no bat house expert by any means, but I've heard that larger bat houses are better because it allows more bats and they're able to be warmer in that regard.
And the way I did it, it's mounted on the south side of my home. Excuse me, and it's set up, like I said, as a nursery. The back 2 chambers are the nursery part, and I actually drilled about nickel, maybe quarter-size holes in each chamber so that the bats can pass through the chambers. So I'm expecting to get some really good footage from the 4-chamber this year.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what, I see your email address. I'll send you a sample.
Sure. Yeah. Fire away.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I hope I get to see that footage too. That's so cool. All right, so now we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. Someone said, is there something to attract bats to the house when you build one? So is there anything other than painting them a dark color?
I think the big thing is just making it sure that you're putting it in a place that's warm enough but not crazy warm. And then if you're able to put it by a wooded area or somewhere where there's water, because everything needs to drink, would be two ways to sort of encourage bats to come around. I know there are people suggest planting in flowers or plants that attract insects that the bats would eat. So I'm not exactly sure what plants those are, but if you're still struggling, that might be something else you might try out.
Perfect. And Rita has a question. She said, so you mentioned things such as wind farms, caving, and the white nose disease. Could you talk about the declining insect populations? Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of bats, based on where, and I know there's like declines in various pollinating insects and some species of insects versus others, but a lot of these bats occur in multiple areas. So like some of these bats you'll find across the whole state, the whole country, just the eastern part of the country. But researchers find that bats, while they do have their insect prey preferences, they'll pretty much go for whatever's in season. And even bats of the same species, if you have a bat that's up in Canada and you have the same species in Nebraska or Georgia, like if there's different, they'll eat different things. If the same insect isn't in all those places, they're going to eat different insects. So I feel like a lot of bat species, they do have their favorite insects that they like to eat, but they'll pretty much capitalize on any insect out there. So a lot of bats they can eat mosquitoes, but would you rather eat a mosquito or a moth if it was on hands? Like you'd probably get better bang for your buck if you chase down the moth. So they pretty much go for whatever's in season and whatever's available to them in their area.
All right, so I'm going to interrupt for just 1 second. There's going to be a poll that pops up on everybody's screen. It's just for Conservation Nebraska to kind of better ourselves. We'll keep going through the questions. We got a bunch here, but we really appreciate your guys' feedback. So our next question is from John. He said he gets bats in his house about once a year, and he has put a bat house on the side of his house. And he was wondering if bats are likely to move to the house or if they will prefer his attic.
Sorry, could you read that again?
Yes, sorry. So John asked, he said that he has bats in his house and he built a bat house, and he was wondering kind of how long or if the bats will move to the bat house instead of his attic.
Yeah, I think as long as the bats are currently living in the attic, as long as that's available to them, unfortunately, they're probably going to keep using it. And so eventually, in order to encourage bats to move to the bat house, you might have to sort of close in where they're able to get into the house, but you don't really want to do that during the early or late spring or early summer when bats are having their pups, because pups, when they're born, they can't fly. So if the bats fly out and then that hole or entrance where they're coming in is boarded up, then the babies aren't able to fly and they'll probably die. And so there's different, especially if there's a threatened species in your house. While it might be a bummer to have the bats in your house, that might be it's probably best to call an expert to come in and see what they can do. But yeah, I feel like as long as the bats have access to where they're currently roosting, they're probably going to roost there, unless maybe if you can get that bat house close to that entrance, eventually they'll see that house and they might decide it's a better place. But that's sort of hoping for the best.
All right. And then Lynn asked, is there anything to be done about white nose syndrome, such as treatments?
So there have been various things people have found, some chemicals that people have found that if they find a bat that's suffering from white nose syndrome, they're able to directly apply these chemicals to the bat themselves, and then they're able to get better. But the problem is there's no real good way to sort of mass apply it, and there's a lot of good fungi out there. And so if you're gonna spray these sorts of chemicals in a whole cave system, you sort of have no idea what else is gonna happen. So there are chemicals, applications that people have found that do help bats recover who are suffering from white nose syndrome. There have also been, so some of those places that were hit first by white nose syndromes, like in the Northeast, there are still some small remnants, some really small populations that somehow have been able to withstand this white nose syndrome. And so they believe that they have developed these resistant genes, or these genes that have allowed these bats to survive white nose syndrome. And they're hopeful that these bats would be able to, it's a sign that bats would be able to keep living and eventually repopulate. Although from, the bats that I've gone through, a lot of these bats, they're long living and they reproduce very slowly. So were that to happen, it would take a very, very, very long time for bats to be anywhere near the numbers they were before this this fungal outbreak. It's also interesting that the researchers think that this disease came from Europe, and bats over in Europe, they don't really form the huge colonies that you find here in the eastern United States. So it'll be interesting to see if this becomes a problem, these bat populations stay low, or if they are able to come back.
Yeah, such good information. Can't get enough. All right, so another question about viruses. Somebody said, other than coronavirus, can those viruses carry on to humans from bats?
Yeah, I think there are various bats in different parts of the world are found to carry different sorts of viruses. So it's best if you do encounter a wild bat, just to leave it alone. Don't mess with it. I don't know offhand of any viruses in particular that bats can directly transmit to humans. I'm sure there are some out there, but you're only likely to get them if you're sort of asking for it. So if you're tromping through a cave with no protective gear on, handling bats, getting bitten by bats, that's the most likely way that you would contract any sort of viruses that these bats might have that would be transmissible to humans.
All right, now we're getting to some easier questions for you. Is there a difference between male and female size and look for bats?
Yeah, for some bats there are. So for instance, the eastern red bat, that bat that's able to take off from the ground, the males the males have a more rich red color than the females do. There is a size difference in some bats, but many bats, it's hard to tell just by looking at it, unless it's like us as researchers, we sort of look at the private parts of the bats in order to tell what sex it is. But there are some sexual dimorphisms with some species of bats, but others not so much.
That's so cool. All right. So somebody mentioned you were talking about the windmills, and they said, could the sound of the windmills be the reason that bats are attracted to them?
It could be. I don't think researchers have really pinned exactly why. So they've theorized that there has been footage of bats trying to drink from the surfaces of cars. And so people think that the smooth surfaces of cars and like windmills, bats mistake that for the surface of water. And so they try to drink from it. So that could be one reason bats are attracted. Also, it might look like a good site for them to roost in. Also, these windmills might attract insects. And the bats really, they don't even need to fly into the windmill. They just need to get close enough, and they're so small, and the windmills spin so fast that just that pressure change, the bats basically explode. So they don't even need to hit the windmill. They just need to get close. So there are some theories out there as to why bats are affected. And there have been some people have tried to mount acoustic deterrents. So they'll actually mount these devices to the ends of the windmills that make these high frequency echolocation calls and sort of try to scare bats away. I think the problem so far is high frequency sound dissipates so quickly, so they're not able to transmit over the length of these arms. So there are a couple theories and a couple of bunch of research going into why bats are attracted to windmills and what we can do to sort of minimize that.
Hopefully we can figure it out, especially here in Nebraska. We have such good wind power going. So we have another question. It says, do bats drink from bird baths?
Yeah, so bats will drink pretty much from any water source, as long as the water is pretty calm and there's not a lot of like vegetation or debris over it. So because bats, they don't really land to drink from streams and ponds as much as they just sort of swoop over it and they sort of skim the surface with their mouth. So bats will drink from bird feeders. Sometimes researchers who try to catch bats in the desert, like a lot of bats, you find them in wooded areas, but there's no real woods and deserts. And so people will put nets over ponds and streams out in the open because everything's got a drink. And so these bats, they'll try to drink and they'll hit the net. And so it's tricky because you don't want the net low enough that the bats drown. But yeah, bats will drink from bird feeders or bird baths, sorry.
That's awesome. So with the cascading loss of all insects, what bat populations in Nebraska would be most affected?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not really an entomologist, but I feel like, bats, they each have their own prey items, but if one sort of species goes out, they'll sort of move to another one. There there are bats that have stronger jaws. And so these bats would be able to eat insects that have harder exoskeletons. So your big brown bats and your hoary bats could eat really hard-shelled beetles and things like that. But your bats that don't really have that bite jaw force in order to eat those sorts of insects probably wouldn't do so well. So it depends on the species and its insect eating capabilities, I would think.
All right, last question. How far will bats fly from their home? And when you say water needed, will they come down and land to drink out of farm water pans, or do you need a larger pond? So you kind of half answered that, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I did see, so those, I forget what they called. I'm fairly new to Nebraska. I'm from Massachusetts, but those wind turbines that pump the water up into those water bins. I know there have been instances of bats will drink from those, but sometimes they sort of fall in and they can't really get out. So putting sort of ladders into those that would allow bats to climb out would be helpful. Those water bins. Bats, it sort of depends. So some bats, in terms of the summer, when they have their summer roosts in trees and they're going out to forage, some can travel. So we were tracking bats, different bats will travel different distances. So the northern long-eared bats that I was tracking at the Homestead National Monument down in Beatrice, which is like an hour south of Boston, Lincoln, we found some that flew up to about 2 miles. So they can fly, they can cover a lot of ground every night, but some bats, they'll roost in the same trees or the same area every night. So they'll fly far and then they'll come back. But some bats, they'll migrate. So bats like ones here in Nebraska, if it gets too cold during the winter, they'll migrate south, much like birds do. And some bats, they like the caves and the mines, which you don't really have a lot of in Nebraska. And so they'll fly to like Missouri, Oklahoma, but then you also have those Brazilian free-tailed bats, which are coming up from Brazil and South America that are flying to Texas to have their babies. So different bats travel different distances. Your more tropical bats probably don't really have to migrate so much if they do. So it probably depends on your species and as to what they'll do.
Man, well, thank you so much. I just want to say this was incredible. I learned so much from you, and thank you so much for going a little bit over time with us. We had so many questions, and we appreciate all of you for participating and just sitting here learning with us tonight. It was so much fun. So lastly, again, I am Brianna Coma with Conservation Nebraska, and I'll be sending a follow-up email to you guys tomorrow with some more information from the webinar. And if you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, check out our Facebook page with some more upcoming events, and we hope to see you guys in the near future. Have a good night, everybody.